This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We're going to get into some controversial stuff today because I want to. And so there are going to be some things that you may disagree with me about. And I want you to know, as I always say, I'm okay if you disagree with me. I am. I'm totally okay with, because this is why we call it the open class. But if you're going to argue with me, make sure that you have your scriptures lined up. That's all I'm saying. I'm not going to listen to people's arguments if they can't back it up with scripture. That's just it's got to be backed up biblically as far as I'm concerned. So if you want to disagree with me, that's good. Just make sure that you've got the scripture to support your position on that, okay? But you're going to hear some stuff today that you may not have ever heard before or thought about before, and it may kind of change the way you think about some things. So I hope so. We're going to talk a little bit about the news. There is some good news and bad news, and so we'll kind of take a look at what's going on there and get into our study today. So let's take a look at some of the news items going on. The first thing is CNN reported that, remember that truce that they were all excited about? Well, now apparently that truce that was supposed to ease ways for peace talks and everything, well, the negotiator for a main Syrian opposition group called the High Negotiations Committee said on Thursday that the truce was close to collapse because of combat attacks against the opposition by the Syrian regime, including Russia, which is conducting airstrikes in the country. So we're not talking about violations of the truce, but talking about the continuation of combat operations and war crimes committed by the regime and its allies. That statement doesn't surprise me, and I don't know how trustworthy it is because I don't know the history of this group. But I thought it was interesting that 2 days ago, the United States made a statement about the truce and how we're honoring the truce and we're not doing anything, and it's holding. The truce is holding. But there were other reports that Russia had flown 18 sorties, bombing sorties, and was just continuing with the bombing that they were doing. So this truce talk is nonsense. There is no real truce. There was an agreement between Russia and the United States that obviously hasn't held, but there wasn't an agreement with all of the parties involved. And so it's don't get all excited when you hear the truce talk, because it's just kind of silly. And it was supposed to be temporary anyway. It was just to give them time to get some supplies into medical supplies and food and things like that into a number of the areas. So truce isn't doing too well. From the Washington Post, Israel is about they're about a year to 2 years away to finishing up the most advanced missile defense system in the world. When it's complete, Israel's multi-billion-dollar missile defense system will rival and in some way surpass in speed and targeting air defenses deployed by Europe and the U.S. The U.S. has provided $3.3 billion over the past 10 years to support the defensive system, which will be able to knock down not only ballistic missiles, but also orbiting satellites. That's pretty amazing, So that's where Israel is just building that up, and they're close to completing it, not quite there yet. From Reuters News, Lebanon's Hezbollah is the vanguard of resistance against the Zionist regime, Israel, and Iran is proud of the group, which is also the champion of the fight against terrorism in the Middle East, Iranian state TV. When Iran starts calling themselves as the champion against terrorism in the Middle East, there's something really, really wrong. I mean, that's just a bold-faced lie if there ever was one. I said there was some good news. Listen to this good news. It's from the Jerusalem Post. The National Intelligence Estimate, known as the NIE, for 2016, drafted by the Research Department of Military Intelligence. The most important part of the new report is the assessment that the probability of war this year is low. Senior military sources tell the Jerusalem Report that this applies on all fronts, from Gaza to the south to Lebanon and Syria in the north. Neither Hezbollah nor Hamas have plans or any interest to initiate a war against Israel. Hezbollah is bleeding in the killing fields of Syria. Hezbollah has lost nearly 1,500 soldiers killed in action, many of whom belong to its elite units, and more than 6,000 have been wounded. Hezbollah's losses are a heavy blow to its military capabilities and have dented its morale to go to war with Israel. In the south, Hamas has not recovered yet from the war in the summer of 2014, which inflicted heavy casualties on its military forces and capabilities, and even more importantly, caused severe damage to the civilian population. Since the end of that conflict, 24 rockets have been fired from Gaza into southern Israel, but they all landed in open areas and caused no casualties or damage. None of them were launched by Hamas. All were fired by small renegade groups, either inspired by or identifying with ISIS, which oppose the Hamas regime and try to provoke Israel into attacking Hamas. Now, that's good news, but it isn't exactly completely correct, because there is an awful lot of stuff that's going down between Egypt and Israel, south of Gaza. That whole area there is just, it's replete with ISIS. Camps being set up. The Bedouin fighters are really connecting now with ISIS, and so that whole area is really, really growing quickly. What is interesting is that the tunnels, more and more tunnels are collapsing between Gaza and Israel. I think there have been something like 6 collapses now of these tunnels. And more and more workers now are saying, according to intelligence, are saying that they don't want to get down there and build tunnels because they think Israel is caving the tunnels in. More than likely, they may be doing that, but they are also trying to build these things so fast that the quality of what they were doing is questionable. And so there have been all kinds of tunnels collapse. Interestingly, Egypt is also working to collapse tunnels. So Gaza, and Hamas in particular, is really struggling with this front on both sides, not only Israel, but also Egypt that is trying to collapse a lot of these tunnels. So there is a lot of question right now among those troops and with Gaza of what's going to happen. I think I mentioned last Sunday that if there is another war, it will probably be the last war that Hamas fights in Gaza, because I suspect that Israel will just say that's it, and they'll go in and take Gaza back over again and refuse to let Hamas exist in that area. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. But the good news is that Israeli intelligence, which is some of the best, if not the best in the world, has finally realized that the probability of war this year is very, very low. Obviously, we'll be keeping watch what's going on. Now, the war is raging across the borders in Syria, as you well know, and so we're keeping an eye on that to see how that develops and how that lines up with what the Bible talks about, specifically, as I've mentioned before, the battle of Gog and Magog. All right, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get into our study today. Father, thank you for the truth that you give us in your word that we can take and apply in our lives and find something that we need on a daily basis. And Father, I pray that you would take your teaching from today, take this passage from today, and give us insight to the way you think and how we can take that and apply it in our lives. I pray this in the holy name of Jesus. Amen. At the close of chapter 10, as we saw last Sunday, we learned that John has been commissioned to prophesy, in other words, to proclaim the truth, to many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. Now, in chapter 11, we're going to discover some things about these peoples, nations, languages, and kings of the tribulation period. From this point on, in our study of Revelation, it gets very, very intense. I mean, it's been intense, no question about that. But it gets there's a lot of little things that are said in Revelation that I want us to really key in on and understand. And so we're going to take our time as we go through it to make sure that you understand it. That's why we're only looking at 2 verses today. But we learned in Revelation 10 that God will, at this point, be no longer patient with the world and its people. In other words, time's up. He's decided that now is the time to make the move. And as God begins to bring vengeance on those that have rejected him, and his children, he starts by focusing his attention on Israel and the temple. Because everything centers around Jerusalem. Everything centers about what's happening in Jerusalem, and everything that's happening in Jerusalem pretty much centers around the Temple Mount. Now, Zechariah 12 and 14 reveal that God will make Jerusalem the cup that will send the nations reeling. That's the way it reads. And really what that means is that there are going to be events in Jerusalem that stagger the world. Also in Zechariah is the prophecy that the nations of the earth will gather against Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will be captured, and half of all of the Jews in Jerusalem will flee into exile. However, anyone who harms Israel will actually be harming themselves because they will have set themselves against God, and that will bring the discipline of God on them and the vengeance of God. And it's precisely that course of action that will trigger the second coming of Jesus and the Battle of Armageddon. So what is happening when these Jews flee from Jerusalem, when there's this mass attack against them, and they flee from Jerusalem, which will happen around it'll start happening before the tribulation. First half of the tribulation, there will be peace in Israel. The second half will be hell on earth. And that they will flee. We'll be looking at some of that in weeks to come. But that will trigger this vengeance from God. Now, that struggle is already underway, as we've seen over the past several months. Israel has made Jerusalem its capital. The United States refuses to acknowledge that. They don't want to admit that Jerusalem, they think, that Tel Aviv is the capital. They're not going to accept it as the capital. The Palestinian Liberation Organization says that Jerusalem should be their capital. And even Pope John Paul II suggested that Jerusalem should be considered an international city, and he even suggested that the Catholic Church move its headquarters to Jerusalem instead of the Vatican. Now, all of this has created absolute chaos in the United Nations. And there is an undercurrent in the United Nations to move against the Jews and to take the city away from them. And if and when that happens, it will mean certain destruction of the United Nations. At the center of all of this is, as I mentioned before, it's all centered on Jerusalem, and everything that happens in Jerusalem is centered on the Temple Mount. The Jews want to rebuild the temple, the heart and soul of their religion. And they want to rebuild it on the same site of the Old Testament temple. The problem is that Islam has a mosque and a shrine there. They have a mosque and a shrine. And they consider the site to be holy ground for them. Now, let's take a look. I want you to take a look at the Temple of the Mount. Here's a actual picture of the Temple of the Mount. And let's kind of look. This whole area here is considered the Temple of the Mount. And there are broken up into 4 quarters over in this area. This area here is the Muslim quarter. This is the Jewish quarter. Over here is the Christian quarter. And down here is the Armenian quarter. And that wall, that's the Wailing Wall, the western wall, is part of the old temple, the old Herod's temple, the one that Herod built for them. So Muslims came along and they took the mount and they built a mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Everybody thinks that the Dome of the Rock is the mosque. It isn't. That's a shrine. But this right here is the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the Muslims, Islam in particular, wants this whole area to become theirs. And now they're demanding that the entire Temple Mount be theirs because there is no temple, obviously no Jewish temple there. And so they don't see any reason why there should be. And they want to claim all of this for themselves. And the Jews want to rebuild the temple. Now, I want you to take a look at this diagram because in this diagram is where you'll see the real conflict. This is a diagram of the inside, the heart of the Jewish temple, which is known as the Holy of Holies. It's where the high priest would enter once a year to meet God and commune with God. Now, this Holy of Holies, there's the altar, and we're going to take a bigger look at the entire temple here in just a moment. But I wanted you to center in on this Holy of Holies because this is where the conflict really, really is. This altar, they would, after the sacrifice, there was the laver there. They would wash the hands. They'd move in through here. The priest would come into this holy place where there were some different artifacts that they used, and then the Holy of Holies here. But you see that blue line? That's the Dome of the Rock. So the Dome of the Rock sits right over the Holy of Holies where the Jews want to build their temple. They want to center their temple in such a way that the Holy of Holies is where it used to be. So, what is going to happen? Well, Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2 give us some real insight. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. That's the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Now, let's look at this temple dilemma. When God tells John to measure the temple, he's not looking for measurements like how long, how wide, nothing like that. But he's saying, look at this temple. He's telling him what the temple is going to look like. So he's giving him a vision, if you will, of what the temple is going to be. And in doing so, he notices that the temple is different than Herod's temple. In other words, this temple that God is showing him is going to be different from the previous temple. Here's a mock-up of what the temple looked like before. This is, and by the way, there are different interpretations of what the temple looked like. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but from the students and archaeologists, they think it's pretty close to this. Now, this entire area is that whole, almost half of the Temple Mount. And this is the inner area, but this whole area, these walls, were all part of the temple. And this whole area out here was called the area of the Gentiles, because non-Jews were allowed in this area out here. They were allowed to go around in here. This area here is known as the outer court, sometimes referred to as the court of women, because women were allowed to go in here, but they weren't allowed to go any further than that towards the inner sanctum. So this whole area, which is really quite large, was the area of where a lot of the teachings that Jesus shared, that was done in this area. There are four corners that are like pavilions, and if you look closely, you can see these columns here. And it was in those areas where these discussions would go on between the rabbis and the Jews, and the teachings would go on. And it was in that area where they would have the money, the places to collect the money, the offerings, and so forth and so on. That's in this area here. As you go in, this, by the way, is the altar, the big altar where they would do the sacrifices. And then the high priest would go into this area, the Holy of Holies. Now, I want you to see this drawing, this sketch of the temple. That'll kind of put it into perspective. Do you see these little ants here? Those are people. So that kind of gives you a perception of how big that whole area is, and how this whole area then is the mount, the Temple Mount. And the mosque, or not the mosque, because the mosque is over here. The dome of the rock is sitting right there. And so that's why there is such a conflict. Now, does the temple have to be built right there? No, there's nothing in the Bible that says it has to be built right there. But that is what the Jews want. That's their desire. No doubt it will have to be different. The temple will have to be different, because God is gathering, and the Bible tells us this, that God is gathering nations, all nations, to the holy city. So there are all kinds of nations and peoples and kings coming to the holy city, to Jerusalem, and apparently for political and religious reasons. And so there's going to have to be a change in this temple to allow for the existence of not only the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and the temple and the people that will be coming to it. So John was instructed to measure the temple and the altar, but not the outer court. He was to measure the holy place and the Holy of Holies, while others could come into the outer court. As I mentioned, only priests could enter those two temple rooms. And the explanation was given that that whole area was going to be under the control of the Gentiles, who would trample on the holy city, not just the court, but the holy city, for 42 months, 3.5 years. And so what God was telling John was the temple is going to have to be different. It's not going to be a temple like the restored temple of the glory days. It's not going to be like that. And it's going to be different for a number of reasons. First is that there was going to be a change in the ritual of sacrifice. You see, God says that a blood sacrifice is no longer needed. The Jews want to restore blood sacrifices. And God's saying it's no longer needed. The ultimate sacrifice has already been paid on the cross. And there's going to be not only a change in the fact that there's not going to be a need for blood sacrifice, there's going to be a change in the size since the court of the Gentiles has been released, turned over. And there's no longer a wall around it. There will no longer be a wall around the temple. And there's going to be a change in the number of worshipers. There are going to be as many worshipers. Remember how many people have been killed or will be killed during this time. So there's going to be a change in the number of worshipers, and there's going to be a change in the building itself, and there's going to be a change in the circumstances in Jerusalem. And God is telling John, this is what's going to be happening during that time. So when he says, let's measure the altar, what is that? There are two Greek words in the New Testament for the word temple. The one word, which is probably the most common word, it's hieron, is a term that refers to the whole structure of Herod's temple, including the courts, the colonnades, all of that stuff. It's all in its entirety. It's the word hieron. Now, the other word is the word naos, N-A-O-S, or N-E-O-S. Naos is narrower. It refers to a smaller part, and it's really referring to the sanctuary or the inner house where only the priests were allowed to go. And this word is used throughout Revelation. So hieron, which refers to the whole temple, which is used throughout most of the New Testament, is a different word. This word, meaning something smaller, naos is the word that's used in Revelation, also in Matthew, where Jesus talks about what's going to happen in the end days. So the word naos is really a key word to understand. And that word says the temple is going to be very, very different and much, much smaller. Now, only one of the two altars is going to be rebuilt. Notice in that scripture that we're reading, it says the altar. It doesn't say altars. It says the altar. And it's probably referring to the golden altar, which was also known as the altar of incense, which sat right in front of the Holy of Holies, and in the inner part. And the bronze altar, which is the sacrificial altar, is not going to be needed. It will not be rebuilt because there is no need for blood sacrifices anymore. This implies that there will be a significant compromise by the Jews with the Muslims. This court of worshipers that it talks about, halfway through the tribulation, as we're studying here, halfway through the tribulation, God is still looking for worshipers. God is still looking for people that will seek Him and would turn to Him. It's interesting, though, that the temple that's going to be built is not going to be built by believers, which means that it's not going to be built by people who believe and follow and obey God. They know that God is. They seek after some truth, but they don't have a personal relationship with Him. The question that really needs to be addressed here is, why rebuild the temple? Why does it have to be rebuilt? The Jews want to rebuild the temple so that they can reestablish their old way of worship. That's the main reason. And it's a source of pride for them, obviously, national pride. But the main reason is they want to reestablish their old way of worship. Yeshivas, which are these Jewish Orthodox religious schools are in existence now to teach that. So there are a number of yeshivas around Jerusalem where people can go and study the law, the Old Testament law, and study how to do the sacrifices and all of that stuff. They're learning how to do that right now. Levitical priests are being trained for animal sacrifices right now. But God doesn't want them to reestablish their old way of worship. This is really important to understand. God doesn't want them to reestablish their old way of worship. God doesn't need them to build the temple. In fact, we're going to see that the temple will never even be used for godly worship. God knows that. There isn't even any, listen to what I'm about to say, there isn't even any clear scriptural support that there will ever be any blood sacrifices offered in the temple, regardless of what the Jews may want. You see, there are a number of schools of thought on this, two primary ones. One is that the temple will be built either right before the tribulation or in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, because the Antichrist, who has made this peace treaty on behalf of Israel, gives him that opportunity to build the temple. He comes up and there's some solution, some sort of compromise with Islam, that they can build their temple. There's that school of thought. The other school of thought is that, which is the one I subscribe to, that the temple will be built during the first 3.5 years, but it won't be ready until that halfway mark, which is where we are right now in our study. And it is at that point that the Antichrist steps in and requires people to, he proclaims himself to be God, and requires people to worship him. Now, if that's the case, then that sacrifice, and the sacrifice has to happen in the temple, that sacrifice can't happen until the second half of the tribulation, because the temple won't be ready, if you subscribe to that school of thought. But if the Antichrist steps in and says, I'm God and you should worship me, then that does away with all the sacrifices, doesn't it? No Jew is going to want to go sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, to the Antichrist. So it is certainly possible and quite probable that there will never be any kind of animal sacrifice in the temple. Now, I know that there are a number of verses in the Old Testament that talk about and are interpreted by a number of people to suggest that there will be blood sacrifices during the millennium. And one of the ways that they explain that is that they will be sacrifices in memoriam of the old way of doing things, which doesn't really make sense at all. If that was the case, then I think Jesus would have said something about it. Instead, what Jesus said was, take this bread and take this cup of wine and do this in remembrance of me. When Jesus talked about memoriams, it was always about him, not about the old law and about the old way of doing things. So my suspicion is that when the Antichrist takes over the temple and declares himself to be God and requires all people to worship him, the temple will actually represent the consequences of sin, which is man continuing to defy God. And there will never be any kind of genuine worship in that temple if the temple is built and opened at halfway point of the tribulation. If it's opened before that, then it's possible that there would be some sacrifices in the temple. But whether or not that's possible because of the conflict between the belief systems between Islam and Jewish, they're not going to want to be, Islam is not going to want to be around anywhere around blood sacrifices. And so there would be some real conflicts there. It's possible, but it's not probable in my opinion. God teaches that the sacrifices that the Jews want to establish or reestablish are not adequate. And that's the point that he's making. Look at what's happened. Look at this new temple. This new temple is much, much smaller because what they want to do is not acceptable. It's not adequate. Look at Hebrews chapter 10, starting with verse 1. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year make perfect those who draw near. In other words, the sacrifices aren't enough to make somebody whole. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And so what God is saying is there is no need for any more sacrifice. The final sacrifice has been paid on the cross. And temple sacrifice is not going to be acceptable. It's not going to be worth anything. So while the Jews rebuild the temple and hope to resume animal sacrifices during the tribulation, they're not thinking of it as being in the tribulation. They're just thinking of it as doing it as soon as they can. Their sacrifices are not going to be accepted. They would not be accepted. And even if they do sacrifices, those who offer such sacrifices will not be accepted by God either. So not only is the sacrifice not acceptable, the person doing the sacrifice is not acceptable, no matter how sincere they are. You see, you can be sincerely wrong. And in this case, they are sincerely wrong. The only sacrifice that God will accept is the sacrifice of His Son on the cross. Hebrews 10, 5 through 7 and verse 10, look at this. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, He said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book." And then in verse 10, "And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." So, there is no need for any sacrifice, any more blood sacrifice. Now, the Jews aren't going to accept that because they want their old way of worship. But here is proof that nothing man can do can make him right in the sight of God. This is really the gist of it. There is nothing that man can do that will make him right in the sight of God. It is all dependent on what God has done or will do. It's not dependent on what man can do, it's dependent on what God can do. You can't trust in what you can do, but only in what God has done and will do. That's why salvation is through faith. It's not through what you do, it's through what God does and you trusting that. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, "By grace you have been saved through faith." And this is not of your own doing, it's a gift of God. Not as a result of works, so that anyone can boast. So it's really important to understand that our relationship with God is based on what God has done, not on what you have done. You receive it, but you don't do anything about it. There's not a bunch of stuff that you have to do, bunch of laws that you have to follow, a lot of things that you have to say to be saved. You just simply have to receive the salvation, and that is an act of faith. Well, what is faith? Trusting obedience to the known will of God. Trusting obedience to the known will of God. Not guessing, but knowing what it is that God wants, and then obeying it. Well, how does faith work? Hebrews 11:6. Right in the middle of this chapter, Hebrews 11, which is considered, they call it the hall of faith, because it talks about all of these people who were considered to have faith. And in every case, these were people that knew what God wanted them to do, and they just did it. And that was considered an act of faith. But here is how faith works. Hebrews 11:6. "Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him." By the way, here is the verse that you can use when people tell you that they're atheists, or people who say they're agnostic and they say, "Well, I don't believe that there is a God. I've never seen God. I've never seen anything that God done." It can be and explain it away. Here's what you tell them. Look, you're not going to see God do anything because He's not going to reveal Himself to you because you're not seeking Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. The reason, when I'm in a discussion with somebody who doesn't believe in God, the reason that there is a disconnect is because I have experienced God. I've sought him, continually seek him, have a relationship with him. I know he's real because he's revealed himself in my life. This person that I'm talking to has never sought after him, so God's not going to reveal himself to him. God says, I will reveal myself to those who seek me. Seek my face, God says. He said, and it says throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that if you want to see God, you have to seek after God. This idea of, oh, God, you're going to have to prove yourself if you want me to believe in you, doesn't work that way. God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. That's the way I memorized the verse. He's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So that's how faith works. It's just trusting obedience to the known will of God. And as you trust him, and as you take those steps, those little steps that lead to other steps, that lead to other steps, through that, God begins to reveal himself, and you establish that relationship with him. Now, in this passage in Revelation, we see that this temple, the temple is going to be defiled. What's that all about? Since John says that the outer court will be given to the Gentiles, it says, it's important to establish what that means. The word that's used is the word ethne, E-T-H-N-E. And ethne seems to have, in the New Testament, the more general sense of it's used as nations. I mean, it's sometimes the word that's used for nations, obviously referring to ethnic or national groups. But in other contexts, it may be a more narrow term referring to Gentiles. In other words, those who are non-Jews, in contrast to the Jews. Ethne. But there is another usage of the word that is very, very curious, and I think it fits here. And that is, Christians through history gradually developed a similar usage of the word ethne to refer to all people who were outside of Christ. Our English word heathen would fit that description. So they referred to ethne as people who were out of Christ. In other words, not a nation, not a people, not an ethnic group of any sort, not a culture, but rather those who were in Christ or out of Christ. And so it's, I think, probable that what John was referring to here was that the outer court, the outside the temple, and Jerusalem in particular, the holy city, has been turned over to those who are outside of Christ for that 3.5 years. And they are going to, and the word that trample is another word that is kind of curious, because it means that they would actually, and the word that's used there could imply just total chaos. It could imply persecution. There are all kinds of ways that word could be used. Now, the purpose of the outer court was for corporate worship. And that's key to understand, that the purpose of the outer court was for corporate worship. Once the outer court gets turned over to the ethne, and they trample on the holy city for 3.5 years, the purpose of the outer court is no longer legitimate. There is no need for the outer court because it's not a place of corporate worship. The word, by the way, for trampling is the word pateo, and it literally means, it can be used to mean kick, it can be used to mean apostasy, defilement, persecution. There's all different ways that word can be used. And as we will study in weeks to come, it most likely means all of those things: defilement, apostasy, and persecution. If various religions are allowed to share the Temple Mount, which is what it looks like is going to have to happen, there will probably not be a wall around the outer court, meaning that it will no longer be a holy place. This is big, big news. Jews really, really struggle with this. Because the outer court was the place for worship. The inner court was for the priests and for the high priest in particular. But the outer court was for corporate worship. And so to come along and say that there won't be any place for corporate worship is really, really upsetting to them. But this is what Jesus is talking about in the Gospel of Luke, particularly in verse 24. Notice this. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword. Look at this verse. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled at the end of the tribulation. So what Jesus was saying is there's the whole city, the whole area is going to be trampled underfoot by the ethne. Although Jesus didn't use that word in Luke. But that's he did in Matthew. But that's the way it was interpreted. But that's the idea that this whole city is going to come under total chaos. And God says, be ready for this. This is what's going to happen. And there will be a decimation of personal worship. Now, when man believes that he can be made right with God by his personal action, and in the Jews' case, by blood sacrifice, he has violated the very reason that Christ had to die on the cross. When man believes that he can be made right with God by his personal action, and specifically for the Jews, blood sacrifice, he has violated the very reason that Christ died on the cross. The temple of the tribulation will mean nothing to God because it will be completely misused. It won't be a holy of holies. God will not meet with the priests because it will have violated the reason that it exists. No man can enter the Holy of Holies with an impure heart. By the same token, there is no such thing as an intimate, personal relationship and fellowship with God unless you meet Him on His terms. It's really important to understand. There is no intimate, personal relationship and fellowship with God unless you meet God on His terms. Sacrifice, blood sacrifice, represents man's terms, attempting to get right with God. But the sacrifice on the cross is God's terms. It's God providing a way to connect with man by God's mercy and His grace. That's the big disconnect. That's the big problem here that Israel, the Jews, are going to have. They want to restore the temple in all its splendor and glory the way it was, the way Herod built it, and they want it to be exactly where it was, and they want all of that in the outer courts and everything so they can have corporate worship and they can have their blood sacrifices, and God says, you don't need that anymore. The ultimate sacrifice has already been paid. And so you're not going to get it. You hear what I'm saying? God says you're not going to get it. God was saying to John, when they build a temple, it's not going to be the one that they think they're going to build. Because it's going to have to work in with all of everything else that's going on in the holy city. And all of the gatherings of all of the nations and the people and the kings and everything as they gather together, there's going to have to be some give and take and some negotiation, and it's not going to work that way. And he may be even saying that it's not going to be built where the Dome of the Rock is. Doesn't say that. But by not saying it, he may be saying it. So, as we study Revelation and we study about the temple, just know this, that God sees the temple as a sign of man's rebellion. God sees the temple as a sign of man wanting his own religion. He doesn't see it as a sign of man seeking after God. He doesn't see it as a way of man wanting to be right with God, but rather wanting to be right with himself. Ooh, that's so important. And the way it applies to us today is in our worship. The worship that we think is so important. Is it really? How does God see it? When you approach God, is it the way God wants you to approach Him? You need to know that. Because if your approach to God, if your worship is about making you feel like you've worshiped, then you have not worshiped. If your worship is about making you feel good and feel, wow, I just love this music, I love this setting, I love this preacher, I love this church, I love, so forth and so on. Seriously? What does God think about it? You see, it's not about what you want. It's about what God wants. That's the bottom line. So when we look back at the Jews and we look back at this temple issue and we look at it and say, wow, they're so deceived. They don't understand that Christ died and He paid the ultimate sacrifice on the cross and so forth and so on. And I'm not going to that church. Man, those people don't know. Their worship is awful. Are you really any better? Now, I'll grant you there are some churches that their worship is awful. And it's really not worship. And they're just going through the motions and emotions. But it's really important that you be careful about you, that you not be that person that's just going through the motions and emotions, but you really are connecting with God. Because if you're not really connecting with God, then why are you playing the game? You're like that outer court that's no longer necessary. There's nothing really happening there. You're just trampling the outer court. You're playing games. You're surrounding it. And there are an awful lot of people who live their Christian life, they call it Christian life, they live their Christian life looking in the windows of the Holy of Holies. They never make it in. They live their life vicariously through other people. Oh, isn't it wonderful what God did in that person's life? Isn't it wonderful that God's doing here? I'm brought to tears at what God's doing in this country. And what about you? What's God doing in your life? How is it with you? Are you just on the outside in the outer court looking in? Or are you actually connecting with God in the Holy of Holies? You've got to answer that question. You've got to answer that question.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.